Why does Ultimate X-Men feel so different? In 2023, Marvel Comics brought back the Ultimate line, sorta. While the name Ultimate Universe was the same as the original imprint which debuted in the year 2000, that being an initiative to garner more readership and provide a more clear entry point, the Earth upon which those adventures were taking place is different than this new Ultimate Universe, new time of recording. The first Ultimate Universe was classified as 1610, while this new one was 6160, a universe being manipulated by a villain named the Maker, an evil version of Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, from the first Ultimate Universe, and a character who had survived its initial collapse in 2015's Secret Wars. This character had broken off and set to conquer a universe further back in the timeline, warp it so that heroes didn't emerge in the same way, and ally himself with key players to assert control over it. This was the overall framework for the backdrop to the new Ultimate Universe. Following the lead-up stories of Ultimate Invasion and Ultimate Universe, 3 ongoing series were announced: Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate Black Panther, and Ultimate X-Men, and eventually they would be joined by Ultimates. There were varied reactions to this concept, the idea that the Ultimate Universe was returning. Some were excited. Some felt it was a cash grab, banking on established branding and that it wasn't being wholly accurate to what the concept was. Some were curious, even more were ambivalent. However, as the comics began to release, a more positive energy began to accrue. Ultimate Spider-Man launched to a very strong reception in particular. Black Panther, while less so, also left many with an overall positive vibe. The one that has enlisted the most polarizing reaction time of recording is Ultimate X-Men by Peach Momoko. It tends to be the one that elicits the strongest love it or hate it reaction. This work is surrounded by a series of questions. Does it fit? Does it work? Is it too different? We took a look at the first issue here on this channel. That issue was released in March of 2024. And as the series has continued to release, the reaction in certain corners has remained fairly split. Of course, this is the internet, so depending upon which corners you've been hanging out in, you may not have heard any of this. But for those who have heard or are just hearing about it now, they may wonder, why is that? There are some reasons that are more obvious than others. I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and let's take a dive into why this Ultimate X-Men series feels so different overall, and discuss whether it is actually out of place in the overall new Ultimate Universe lineup. First, some context. Ultimate X-Men is written and drawn by Peach Momoko, a creator who had previously done work with Marvel with the project Demon Days. Demon Days was a reimagining of the Marvel Universe through the lens of Japanese folklore. She was then approached while teaching for the Marvel Art Atelier program by Marvel Comics editor-in-chief C.B. Cebulski. This about whether she'd be interested in taking on Ultimate X-Men. In an interview, her husband stated, "It was very, very random. CB Cebulski just kind of called us and we stepped out of the studio. CB sat me and Peach down and just suddenly was, at that time, we were finishing Demon Wars, so CB suddenly asked, do you want to take a break from the Demon series? We were like, whatever is fine, we will take a break. We thought it was a break from interiors. But then he said, well then, would you like to do Ultimate X-Men? So it was just very random. We said okay, and we didn't know what Ultimate X-Men was at that time, but we knew it was a big project. And CB told us about Jonathan Hickman and all the other big projects both in the past and current, and we were both like, it sounded interesting. And Peach likes the X-Men, so we said okay. In interesting parallel to the first Ultimate X-Men, which was written by Mark Millar, like Mark Millar before her, Momoko was not overly familiar with the team or their history. Her familiarity up to that point was for the research she had done for Demon Days and then would continue to do for Ultimate X-Men. She stated, I wasn't too familiar with X-Men before researching them when I created Demon Days and now Ultimate X-Men, but I generally always loved the concept of mutants using their power for and against humankind as well as each other, and that they were generally treated as outcasts from society. While Miller was also initially not well versed, his entry point was the X-Men film from the year 2000, and he would branch out to the comics. Momoko was given a different task, which was to present the X-Men through a Japanese lens. She stated, it is a bigger shared universe with other creatives, but I feel like I'm still kind of independent. Jonathan and CB kind of just let me do whatever. They just gave me what if X-Men but in Japan, but with a whole new roster of X-Men. Not Wolverine, not Cyclops, not the popular ones. That's why it's Hisako, Armor, and more centrally Japanese. Although it is shared, but because there is not too much that overlaps between Hickman's story and my story, I kind of believe that Jonathan Hickman chose me to just go wild with how I wanted to tell the story. So right from the outset, Ultimate X-Men was a bit unique in how it was going to be presented, and it was always a bit off in its own space. And this is a key point in understanding why some of it feels so different. From the outset, it was already a little outside. Ultimate X-Men is a story about mutants discovering their powers and themselves, with an emphasis more on the self-discovery, with powers taking a back seat. It is a slow burn mystery surrounding the death of those who bully Hisako's friends to suicide, who are now being compelled to take their own lives at the behest of a strange shadowy figure who stalks Hisako. One who she has ties to, even if she's not quite sure how yet. It's a tale so far of finding friendship and acceptance, with some pretty cool horror elements. While some enjoy this difference, and it is something unique for this new universe, and it may feel like the perfect place to try it out, the question for some then becomes, how does it slot into the overall lineup? So since we've started to touch on some of the differences, let's break them down. Starting with the most obvious, the art. While Marvel doesn't have the same rigid house style it once did, there is still a general conception as to what superhero comic book art both does and should look like, and for many, Peach's art falls outside of it. This is what some deem as manga art, although of course that is a very generalized statement because there are many different stylings of anime art, but for some there's an overall conception just of what it generally looks like, and this is falling into that. And as such, for many this elicits a different response, a different feeling or expectation of tone, and some may find it jarring, especially if they are less familiar with it, or even if they are, for some it's a crossing of the streams. Now if you enjoy Momoko's art, this could be a welcome change, or even exciting. But like or dislike it, the art is one quick reason why this book feels so different. It's instantly visually distinct, not just from the rest of the Ultimate line, but from Marvel Comics in general. And for some, that makes it difficult to reconcile. And it's not just the look, this is also a very Japanese story, especially culturally. This is another difference. Once one gets into the issues themselves, this is a work that is very Japanese culturally. It's full of references to folklore, religious ceremonies, school rituals, fashions, and more. And to those not versed or familiar with Japanese culture, either through exploring it in other media or just encountering it in other facets of life, this could make these stories feel quite foreign. Each issue even contains a lexicon explaining certain items or happenings in the story, and miles will vary as to whether this is fascinating and an entry into an exciting new take on X-Men, or off-putting and too far removed. And this, coupled with the art, they're layering together to make this feel much more like a manga to some, and not necessarily even an X-manga, because some of the points we're going to highlight coming next. One of the things that's also different for some is the genre. While Ultimate X-Men has its share of action and actually some decently creepy horror elements, they take a back seat to the slice of life element. They are bolstering that, not the other way around. It's not an action-forward work. These stories are very much about Hisako discovering her powers and making friends, and the mystery of her shadowy antagonist, and the overall world, all against a traditional high school setting. And while to some this more slice of life feeling may be comfortable and familiar, it may not be what everyone is looking for when it comes to the X-Men. While the X-Men has had its slice of life moments, in general, that's not what people think of when they do think of it or conceive of it in their minds. It's also not usually the focus, but rather an accent. Although others would argue X-Men is known as a bit of a soap opera, but for many it's about balance. This again is piling on top of the changes we've already mentioned, leading to that feeling for some that this just simply isn't an X-Men book. It's something else. A sentiment that is also aided by a lack of familiar grounding characters. Now, Hisako, or Armor, has been around for a while. She debuted in the main 616 universe in Astonishing X-Men number 4 in 2004. She was created by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. She has the ability to create a psionic exoskeleton, which she can also do in this comic, although it's also tied to a charm that was given to her by her shadowy antagonist, most likely the Shadow King. And so at times the way it's drawn, it appears like it's emanating from that, but it's not. It's coming from her, but it's just also tied to that emotionally, because the way mutant powers manifest in this is very tied to emotions. Hisako hasn't been the most prominent character overall, in the main universe that is. And some were just expecting a more traditional lineup for the Ultimate X-Men. Momoko was interested in the character because she was Japanese, and this series was going to have that be a focal point, and many of the main X-Men were off the table. And if you take a bird's eye view, it does make sense that the maker would try to get a handle on the more well-known X-Men who he can foresee as a problem, having dealt with them before. But from a customer standpoint, this character is less well known. And there is the idea that even if this is the Ultimate Universe, some don't want it to be too different. While others will feel this is the perfect place to really try and play around and be creative, others want it a bit more confined. More what if, but a closer what if. On working with Armor, Momoko stated, "I was just looking through Japanese X-Men characters and saw Armor as a very interesting character to explore. I never write a story first and decide on character. I always choose a character and let the character tell their story to me. Of the other characters included here, most of them are new creations by Momoko. Some have appeared before, like Mei Igarashi, Maystorm, who is actually the result of a variant cover initiative. Another character born from a variant cover. Move over, Gwenpool." On her creation, Momoko stated, "The inspiration for Maystorm was the New Champions variant cover program that asked me to design a Japanese schoolgirl that idolizes Storm. So I wanted to make sure I kept the key visuals of the Japanese schoolgirl uniform and fused it with the iconic Storm, especially took influence from her mohawk punk look. Momoko has taken this Ultimate X-Men series as an opportunity to flesh May out. give her a backstory, show how her powers manifested, and the like. For Momoko, a lot of the crucial elements of the X-Men revolve around their powers as a metaphor for coming of age. The idea of these stories working through learning to understand oneself and ostracization. But there's also a more personal story being foregrounded. Momoko stated, "I'm writing many of the stories looking back at my own experiences and what I saw during my own time as a student in junior high and high school, but also keeping in mind and comparing the similarities and differences of the environments that young children find themselves in today." This statement leads us neatly into another difference. Theme. Now, because of the aforementioned, there's a distinct lack of something in the 4 issues that have been released time of recording. And that is the whole, in a world that hates and fears them. There's a general oppression and hatred of mutants that has come to be quite a part of X-Men lore. It's a very prominent facet of it. And while there have been many stories over the years where that has not been the focus, and you can tell stories where it isn't, that tends to be the perception of what the X-Men are/should be about. And it's something that they leaned into quickly, and some of their most well-remembered moments and stories do foreground this aspect. It's become embedded in the concept of the team. This can lead to the idea that it should be that way for every story. That there should be a focus on persecution and a general overall societal atmosphere that mutants are hated and not trusted. And that's really not present or coming through in Ultimate X-Men. It doesn't even necessarily seem to be the case. If it is, it's not foregrounded or it's not something that the characters are focused on in this story. They're more concerned about the other things that are happening to them, which again, can and does happen. But when compounded with all the other differences is yet another thing that makes it feel different to some. So while, as mentioned, there are many ways to interpret the X-Men and many different stories to tell, for some the way this is being filtered through these high school students' issues and a more generalized look at ostracization and bullying may feel tonally dissonant, while for others it may be a welcome reminder of the breadth of types of stories the X-Men can encompass, that there are other ways to look at them, and again the idea that this is another universe, so maybe things are different in this universe, or they're just different because of the different location and culture. That this could be an examination of the different ways that mutants are treated because of the Maker's world, even though again, if that's the case, that hasn't been explicitly mentioned, at least not in Ultimate X-Men. Powers have thus far manifested in periods of intense anger or fear, which while this is a familiar beat, the powers and learning to control them is less foregrounded. The focus is much more on the lives the girls are living. Their concerns encompass many other things, and their powers aren't always at the forefront of their concerns. In fact, a lot of the times they aren't even thinking about them. So far, being mutants is a background factor. Hisako is pretty unconcerned about whether she is a mutant at all. May seems to know that she is and accepts it, and her and May are openly identified as mutants by another girl who herself identifies as one out loud in front of people, and nothing happens. Hisako has some concerns about being identified and seen using her powers, but that again feels like a more generalized fear. More playing with the ideas of not wanting to stand out, wanting to blend in. Hisako has been labeled as weird and has been ostracized since the death of her friend, and so she is largely excited to have friends and be able to be living a more normal life despite everything else that is going on. There's a lot of high school fears here. A central concern is bullying. The book moves at a fair clip, with weeks passing between mutant incidents, and the Shadow's reach is also more personally based. Again, this is a miles may vary moment. Some will enjoy this more parsed down, personal feeling story with mutant elements. A bit of a break from all the world-ending events the X-Men are usually involved in. A reminder that there are mutants everywhere and they could be living all types of different lives and be having all types of different stories. While for others, once again, this will be too far removed. The idea is that the book is called Ultimate X-Men and that it should feel more like a standard X title, even if it is in this other universe. These are the core reasons why Ultimate X-Men feels so far removed from the rest of the Ultimate books. There are all these factors and they also tend to stack on top of each other, where for some maybe one or two would be manageable. The fact that there are so many can be off-putting. As a result, this book raises far more questions than the others as to how it's going to fit into some kind of overall Ultimate universe. When/if the time comes for a big showdown for the fate of Earth 6160. How it will fit in remains to be seen. A lot of that will be determined by how the line shapes up moving forward. So while an interesting question, and one that will lead to some thought involving creative decisions, particularly around art, although we have already seen some of the mutants already in other books, and on variant covers, nothing there is set in stone or insurmountable. The story of a group of teens drawing something bigger than themselves is a familiar one. Ultimate X-Men can be a micro story drawn to the overall macroverse. It could be the kind of thing where at the very end of Ultimate X-Men, it's tied into the big events happening in other books. The more pertinent question time of recording is, how is Ultimate X-Men as its own book? Because even if it is another universe, it still bears that X-Men title, and so it has expectations pun not intended, placed upon it, because there is all that history that is coming with it, even if it's not something that is being worked through with the author. The question remains, is this book good or is it bad? The thing is, a lot of that is going to be determined by what you are expecting from it. Let me explain. There are objective things one can say about this story, about the art, about the pacing, about the narrative, but a lot of reaction to Ultimate X-Men is preceded by whether the work itself is off-putting to the reader based on all the aforementioned differences. Basically, some could find all of the elements to be in place and being well executed, but because of all those differences already, it still feels like not an X book to them. So the question of it being good or bad for some can be surmounted by the idea that they just don't feel that it's X-Men. So at times for some, it ends up being a two-parter answer. Yes, but also, or no, but also. This raises the question as to how far is too far? How many differences or changes can be made before something is no longer what it once was? Would it be different if there were only one or two of the aforementioned differences? For example, genre and art, but the characters were the characters people were familiar with. Is it the combination of all of them that is too much, or are people simply not giving it a chance? Or is it not what was advertised? Or was it not made clear enough what they were going to be getting? While I enjoy Ultimate X-Men and find it unique and interesting, I can also see and understand why for others it wouldn't be enjoyable or would not feel like X-Men. For me, the fact that this is an alternate universe helps smooth the differences. However, all the other works are sticking closer to base than this one, and while the Ultimate Universe can be different, it tends in general not to move too far afield. And so for some, this is too far. The field's all the way over there now. It also, in general, is not a work without flaws. It has some pacing issues, and while it plays somewhat with horror imagery and can get quite intense, not shying away from certain provocative moments, on the whole, nothing feels quite urgent. It can also at times leave one scratching one's head as to how certain connections are happening, like how May recognized Hisako that first time. Some things are a bit loose. But for me, it feels like an alternate universe X-Men that's simply coming at the concept a bit of a different way. It's coming at it from a different direction. And while that may work for me, I want to hear about whether it works or not for you. What do you think? Is it working for you? Is it not? Do you think it's just too different? Do you think it can blend into the overall line? Do you like that it's different? Are you enjoying it on its own separate isolated merits, or do you find it flawed there as well? Would you agree that those are the main differences? Let me know your thoughts down below. And while you're down there, please do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that bell notification so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking some time today spent discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.